Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome to the lagoon! Welcome back, everybody. This week we have a giveaway. I'm going to give away some of these Oxito LED headlights. These are the H7 specification ones that fit this Porsche 996. I did make a video on these already. There's a short. I'll put a link to it up here somewhere. And so if you'd like to win these, just watch this video and there will be a very easy way to win it later on in the video. Those of you who are regular viewers will know that since putting this rebuilt engine back in, I've been having a problem with hot start issues. And really what I mean by that is if you leave the car for 30 or 45 minutes that it's hot, then you come back to it. When you turn the key will turn, the starter will go, but the engine won't fire. It will fire if you put your foot to the floor for a couple of seconds and then boom, it'll jump into life. No problem. And then after that, it'll run just fine. You can turn it off and start it back up again and it's lovely. It's just that time when you first come back to it when it's hot. Now, apparently that's a common problem and I'm resorting to a cheat sheet here because there are so many things that it could be that it wasn't. And a lot of the reason for these videos is to help you folk because you have all helped me so much. And so I'm going to go down the list here. We're going to start with everything that it wasn't. And so specifically what it wasn't was an electrical problem. Really what was going on here, you could divide it into two areas. Is it either electrical or is it fuel based? And so I know it's not electrical, so let's talk real quick about what I went through on that, what you guys recommended, and how we ended up coming to that conclusion. All right, so option one, I did a voltage drop test. We had that fancy gizmo sent to me, and I used that to check the voltage drop on startup. And I also got that new clamp voltage meter. And what we did with that is really when you start the engine, you're looking to see how much the voltage drops from the battery and compared with where it is on the starter motor. And we found that the voltage drop was totally within spec, and so it wasn't that issue. But that could be a sign of something that a lot of you said, which was the Y cable, which goes from the B plus junction box over to the starter motor and the alternator. And so that is a thicker cable that is separate and has that Y name because of one end going to the B plus junction box and the other end wiring off to the starter motor and the alternator. And so that takes the higher voltage, higher amperage from the battery to run those two systems that need all that power. And so a lot of you had said that if it's the Y cable, that when they get old, they get kind of corroded, and that increases their resistance, and that when they get hot, they don't work so well. And so you can end up with like maybe a slow starter. I'm not sure exactly because I don't have that problem. But the reason I know it's not that issue, and it turned out not to be that issue, is because it'll do it the first time when it's hot, but it doesn't care after that. It'll work just fine after that. So I don't think it's this wire not working because it's heat soaked, so to speak. So yeah, coolant temperature sensor. So that was last week. That's a cheap sensor, something that on a high mileage car that I never had this car running. I bought it broken, you know, and so there could be anything broken on it. And replacing the coolant temperature sensor was a pretty cheap thing to do. And the reason to do that relating to this issue is because the car might think that it's doing a hot start when it's not, and will set things up differently is the presumption. And that by replacing the coolant temperature sensor, you will send accurate signals to the onboard computer and it can start up with the correct mixture and ignition angle, etc. And so we did replace the coolant temperature sensor. It helped regulate the temperature slightly better, but didn't fix the problem. Resetting the e-gas is another one. This car has kind of like the F-16 Falcon fighter jet. It has fly-by-wire, and so the throttle is not actually connected with a cable to the pedal. It's using just a computer connection. And so the deal there is to reset that. You're supposed to turn the car on for 60 seconds and then turn it off for at least 15 seconds. And apparently that resets that e-gas throttle. So I tried that, but it wasn't that. Next one then was the crankshaft position sensor. We did that before we put the engine in the second time. Again, that's a very common one to be replaced. It's in a very hot part of the engine, a grimy part of the engine. It turned out that that wasn't the problem. The reason we might think that that was the problem is if it was malfunctioning, it's supposed to send signals to the onboard computer, letting it know where the crankshaft is and where all of the timing parts should be. And if it's not getting a good signal, then it can delay the startup, and it's supposed to go to like this default program. But again, that wasn't our problem, so I don't really know. And so replacing the crankshaft position sensor didn't fix our problem, but it might have. And again, it was a cheap part that we threw at it on an unknown engine. Why not? And we did that when the engine was out that second time, just because it's a little fiddly to get to when the engine is in the car, and so why not? All right then, the starter motor. So of course, the starter motor not spinning fast enough is certainly going to be an issue. This starter motor, I did bring it to a automotive electrical place, and they tested it and they said it tested great. And so I wasn't going to think it was that, and it turns out it wasn't that, but that's something it could be, the starter motor. Along that same line then is it could be the battery. I did replace the battery in this a second time since I had the car, and got the one that had the highest cranking volts, and so I didn't think it was that, and it wasn't that. Again, along those lines is the alternator. If that's not charging up properly, then when you come back to the car, perhaps it doesn't have enough juice to fire up as well that time. It's a reasonable option, but in this case it wasn't that. Another thing then that people talked about is the grounding points. We did come across a couple of grounding points in the front when we were doing our Oxito headlight replacement. There's also a couple in the back by the engine that we touched, and then I'm told there's some in here by the B-pillar, but we haven't messed with those. But again, if you're having an electrical issue, those are something that are definitely worth looking at. Perhaps they've got rusted, perhaps they have some water sitting on them, but in our case, it wasn't that. Next then, fuel pump relay. The fuel pump relay hangs out just here. You'll break your back trying to get to it, but perhaps that is malfunctioning. They're readily available online, and it wasn't our fuel pump relay. All right, let's move on to what it actually turned out to be, which is a problem in the fuel system. The key to figuring that out was by renting a fuel pressure gauge from the local auto parts store for months. It was a free rental, basically you just pay for it, and then if you don't bring it back, you own it kind of thing. And it was around $180 or so, but like I said, I did bring it back and they gave me my money back. But that really was key. And so the fuel rail is just in the back on the passenger side of the engine, and it was missing a cap, so I don't know if that's a sign that somebody was in there before messing around. I also didn't know if maybe the cap being missing was a reason why we would be missing fuel or fuel pressure. But certainly no smell of fuel from the car in general, and so I didn't think there was like some obvious leak going on. Put the fuel pressure gauge on there, and what I found is that when the car was running, the pressure was okay. It was in like the 45, 55 kind of PSI area. But when I shut it off, the pressure dropped really quite quickly. Apparently sort of 2 or 3 PSI an hour is acceptable. It's not really supposed to lose any. But mine was losing up to 10 PSI or more in an hour. And so really just dropping fuel pressure very quickly there indeed. And so the question is why? And so looking here at some options, I put out a lot of questions online, and I'm going to put up some names somewhere to try to go out to a lot of the you that helped me come up with this answer. Really, the one person that hit the nail on the head and sort of kind of had an answer as well is Ed, who is a viewer, a subscriber, and a member, and a pilot, though he's taken, ladies, sorry. He ended up sort of really putting me on to what the answer really was. So Thank you, Ed, but thank you to everybody for all of your help. And I hope this video is helpful to all of you guys as well. Anyway, let's get on with it. Was it the missing cap? No. Next then, injectors. So a lot of you said injectors, and you kind of poo-pooed the whole fact that I had the injectors rebuilt, though witch hunters who rebuilt them, and I really have a lot of faith in those people. And the injectors that I gave him, assuming you believe them, right, and I do believe him, the injectors that I sent to him checked out really very good indeed, even before he cleaned and refurbished them. And then of course after he refurbished them, they tested very well indeed, like new. And so one of you gave me a suggestion, and I hope I'll remember who, and I'll put the name up here, about clamping off the fuel pipes that go to the fuel rail. And so if you clamp off the one that goes back to the fuel tank, then that will tell you that it's the fuel injectors leaking. But if you clamp off the one that goes to the fuel injectors, then that will tell you that it's something in the fuel tank leaking. Now that was very good advice, because that seemed to suggest that the leak was coming in the fuel tank side. So not on the engine side, but on something towards the fuel tank. Fuel pressure regulator, that is on the fuel rail on the passenger side again. The way to check that is to unplug it, and the fuel pressure on your fuel pressure gauge that you've plugged in should shoot up. That's a good thing. If fuel shoots out of the little pipe on your fuel pressure regulator, that's a bad thing. And so I did that on my fuel pressure regulator, and the fuel pressure regulator is fine. Moving on then, so the fuel pressure sensor, I did replace that. I got one cheap locally, and why not, right? And we replaced that a couple of weeks ago. But really that is more to do with if you leave the gas cap off. These cars don't have a fuel pressure sensor, so to speak. I'd like to be able to rig one up, but I think you'd have to put a fuel pressure sensor onto the fuel rail that was able to Bluetooth or something to a sensor inside the car. Let me know if you guys know a way of putting a fuel pressure sensor onto one of these cars. So the fuel filter, sure, I replaced the fuel filter on this car. They're very awkward to get to. We did it when we had the transmission and the engine out, which made it a lot easier. Still kind of awkward though. And so perhaps I didn't connect one of those connectors properly, or maybe there's a crack in one of those pipes. Fair enough, but again, no fuel smell. If there's 40 psi, 50 psi in this system, that's going to make fuel squirt out of a hole fairly readily, and so nothing like that is happening. And so I didn't think it was that. It turned out it wasn't that. Next then, the regeneration valve. I'm learning a lot about the fuel system on this car. So the regeneration valve, it's taking, let's just say, fuel that is not required after the engine is shut off from the front part of the car, the fuel tank system, and allowing it to get burnt in the intake next time you start the car. And the idea with the regeneration valve being broken is that perhaps it's staying open and it's allowing all of those fumes into the intake, and then when you try to start the car, it's already flooded and therefore won't start. And so I did check the regeneration valve when we had the vacuum smoke pump thingy, and it seemed to work out okay. The other thing I did too is I just completely blocked off the regeneration valve so that it couldn't allow any excess fumes into the intake, and the problem still occurred, so that isolated the regeneration valve. Okay, this is something that I didn't look into at all, but someone online was saying that in the fuel pump, some of those pipes that are on there, after getting old, they can rupture, and that can be a reason that you're losing some of your fuel pressure. And that's not far off the problem that we actually ended up having. Okay then, let's talk about what actually happened. What was occurring then is when we turn off the car, the engine area is really hot if we've been running the car for a while. And then when we come back to the car, the fuel pressure has dropped. And what that's allowing happen is the fuel is not necessarily boiling, but it's turning into a vapor. And that is blocking, like a bubble, It's blocking all of the fuel that wants to come through from the tank when you're trying to crank it. And so I found that a way to get it to start was by holding my foot down to the floor. And what you're doing there is opening the throttle all the way. You're letting all that vapor through and finally getting some good colder gasoline, or the kind of gasoline it likes, I guess. And then it will fire up. And the reason for that was the non-return valve in the fuel tank. And that is there to stop the fuel from returning, as the name suggests. When you shut the car off, it holds the fuel pressure so that next time you start the car up, that boom, it will start up no problem. And so Ed had suggested that I get one of these one-way valves, which I did. This little fella got a handful of them off Amazon, and they are an all-aluminum one-way fuel valve. I was going to install it just on top of the fuel tank on the outside, and I'd sort of lined up what size I needed for that. But then I decided I would be brave and open up the fuel tank and the fuel pump and try to see exactly what the problem was.
To get this bird's eye view of the fuel pump, you'll need a 10mm wrench, a 13mm socket, and maybe a few minutes of episode 79 on the fuel pressure sensor. First order of business is removing this fuel vent pipe by pressing the grey button. The other two pipes come off in a similar manner, and then the electrical connector is a matter of squeeze and pull. This plastic collar needs a Porsche special tool that I don't have. This hammer and large screwdriver does seem to work quite well though, almost fun even. A bunch of whacks get that thing going, and then just pull it off. Before opening the tank to the hazards of my suburban garage, I thought I'd have a bit of a vacuum clean around the edge just to limit the depths of my future regret. And you just pull up on the plastic, and then those two pipes on the bottom have the same sort of two grey buttons on them, but there is a mechanism to allow you to press both buttons at the same time. Then using a hose removal spike to get that electrical connector off, it was quite stubborn. Next is the fuel level sender, which is what forms the cap on the fuel tank. You can see in there, that is the fuel pump itself. We're removing that little rubber seal there. Then you have to reach in and turn that fuel pump solidly to the left counterclockwise till it clunks. Admittedly, it's a little fiddly, but really just grab hold of those pipes and the wire and use them to pull the fuel pump out by its hair. The pump itself is just that smaller circle in the center with the two wires coming out of it. You can see there in the bottom of the fuel tank the clamp that the fuel pump clips onto. Here is our fuel pump assembly in all its glory. That's that button there that sort of presses both buttons at the same time. And that's the electrical connector. And then looking down here, that is the one-way valve, and it has an arrow on it showing what way is the one-way. What I am suspecting is that due to age, that rubber is not as supple as it once was, and rather than stopping the flow in one direction, it's letting a little bit of fuel creep through. These are the three different sizes of aluminum one-way fuel valve that I got off Amazon. I ended up going with the middle of the three, kind of the Mama Bear version. There is a link in the description if any of you would like one. We're going to remove the old one-way valve by cutting each end of the hose with a scalpel. Initially, I had used some hose clamps that I had lying around to attach the one-way valve, and one of them kind of stripped. And then I realized that all hose clamps are not the same. You want to use the ones that don't have the holes all the way through. They're a much better design and they work much better. The bottom part here has a filter of sorts. I did clean that off best I could with some compressed air and a brush. When we're putting it back in, we're going to put it straight down into the bottom of the tank and then clamp it by turning it clockwise. There we go, just lower everything into the tank. Put that little rubber seal back on, pulling all the items up out of the way, the hose and the electrical connector. Next, we're going to put in the fuel level sender. Lovely. And then the ring that goes back on top of that. I tightened it up until the point where it was really nice and snug. I probably should have marked it with some whiteout or something to know where I'd started from, but I didn't. And then 3 pipes, 1 electrical connector. And that's the main part of the job done. We're just going to put the battery tray back in with its 4 13 mils and all the rest of that stuff that you can catch up on if you need to in episode 79. Alright then, with everything reassembled, we ran the car and then shut it down and then monitored the fuel pressure, and it didn't go down at all. In actual fact, it went up slightly over time. So I consider that fixed.
So this little thing was all it took to fix the hot start issue on our Porsche 911. So thank you very much for watching to the end. If you would like to win these H7 fitting Oxito LED headlights, in the comments, please just put in there why you really need these headlights, and whichever is the funniest answer, I will choose. And it doesn't matter where you live on planet Earth, I will send these to you, I promise. Unfortunately though, that is all we have time for this week. Please, if you like this content, subscribe and like and all that good stuff. But that is all we have time for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Till next time.